Ready?
Okay.
3, 2, 1, go.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Peggy Lyons, and I want to welcome you to the Board of Selectmen special meeting this Thursday, March 9th at 5:30 p.m. Please all rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. And with that, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, great. Thank you very much. So with that, moving on to item number 2, I'd like to make a motion to approve the consent agenda as presented this evening.
So moved.
Second.
Okay, any questions or comments on the consent agenda?
No.
Great. With that, all in favor, say aye.
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 Jen, we
Okay.
stole that. We stole the consent agenda from the Board of Ed, by the way.
We did.
Oh,
This is
nice.
Yeah, it was.
agenda
just
passes
done.
unanimously. It is. It's a. I think it's been a
It got
huge. That was a great call on Bruce's part because it's been a huge time saver for us.
Mhm.
Moving on to item number 3, and is discuss options and next steps relating to the regulation of cannabis sales, use, and cultivation in the town of Madison. And so what I'd like to do is invite up, let's see who's on here.
I don't see Carrie on the list.
Okay, I know I just spoke to her an hour ago, and she should be coming soon here. But with that, I think we can talk just generally to update the public on a couple things. Also, actually, I think one of the things I had wanted to discuss was at our last meeting, we were kind of we talked a lot about a referendum possibility, taking a question to referendum. I think a lot of us felt we didn't really know where the town stood on this issue, that, there hadn't been a lot of public participation, Bruce, during your committee. And some of that's just timing, whatever. There just hadn't been a lot of, feedback from the public on this. And the discussion was possibly doing a survey, and I included a draft survey that Guilford had put out that they had a lot of participation in, and we don't have to necessarily use theirs only, but just as a framework. And then Sherry Cody, which I'm not sure Sherry's on tonight, but she shared that with us, what Guilford had sent out. And I thought if we could spend the next week crafting something that works for us, that's a great way to at least get some data points out there.
Mhm.
And then the other thinking was actually having a draft ordinance
Here she is.
to put out there to the public, and see what the reaction is to that. And so with both of those, the survey and then seeing what we hear back from a public hearing and everything, that would give us a better assessment of where the public might stand on this issue and whether or not we want to just, move an ordinance, whether or not we want to go some other pathway. We also had some discussion about, going through planning and zoning to regulate versus going through an ordinance route. So that's why I've invited Carrie here. And then in your packet is Carrie, welcome. And Carrie, you may not have met Jen Gordon is our new board member. So she's been with us for the last month. And
welcome, Jen.
Thank you, Carrie. Nice to meet you.
And I commend you for your public service. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much.
We haven't hazed her yet, Carrie. That's
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, at least she'll feel good before you haze her.
That's right.
Well, and so Carrie kindly drafted quickly for us a draft ordinance that would effectively ban cannabis on town property, and then also ban the sale of cannabis, retail sales and cultivation of cannabis in Madison. And so that's a draft ordinance is in your packet, and I can let her talk a little bit about that in a minute. But I think all of us felt a little uncomfortable because we were really not sure where the public is there. I know the advisory committee had had a kind of a split vote, right, Bruce, where a majority voted banning it, but there was still support to, or, there were some members who didn't want to ban it. So, but we thought the best way to get reaction from the public is when you have something for them to read and review and think about, and then we can get actual feedback versus kind of more amorphous, comments at a public meeting. So, so with that, I'd like, if Carrie, one of the things before we talk about the ordinance itself, and I sent around to the, and I apologize, I meant to put this as a slide. There was an article that came out that showed what towns are doing, right, for regulating cannabis. And it was all over the place. Some towns are using planning and zoning. Some towns are using the ordinance route, some are allowing it, and so I don't think it's like, well, 90% of the state is going in this direction, so that maybe is the right way to go. It's really depending on what our community wants and what are characteristics of our community. And I know Bruce had some specific questions about planning and zoning and their role in this. And so maybe, Bruce, if you want to ask some specific questions of Carrie on that, and then we can get to the ordinance that she presented.
Yeah, sure. I think Carrie, it wasn't so much questions is that as Peggy and I discussed paths forward and things that would make sense, we talked about the planning and zoning route, and the question came up with a nod in the way that we wanted them to go as they deliberated as a group. Could they decide to come to a completely different decision? In other words, can we tell planning and zoning what to do, or do they have the prerogative to make up their own mind and follow their own path?
So what I will say to you, Bruce, is obviously this is a relatively new legislation. It's 300 pages long. It's pretty comprehensive. But like many things that happen in the legislature, they don't always touch on every little nuance. What is clear is that what you decide to do can be done either through planning and zoning or through an ordinance. And as a municipal attorney, I think my take on this is that if you intend to ban it, it would likely be best done by ordinance. If you plan to allow it, but with restrictions on where it can go and what it can be near and all of that, to me, that's probably best addressed through planning and zoning. So the word that came out to me was the majority vote was to ban. And I actually took it one step further, as I explained to Peggy, and I added in this ordinance, draft ordinance, prohibition on use on public property. I wasn't asked to do that, but I did do it because, again, I felt it was worthwhile for you to think about it. And that's the way I look at this meeting tonight, is we're trying to get public input, your feedback, what your questions are, where your feelings are headed. And so to me, to send you something that was a little more comprehensive so you could think about all of the issues at once was probably worthwhile. And I was also under the impression that to the extent that the town wanted to ban it, they were somewhat in accord with the notion that the better way to do that would be through an ordinance. So, so to your question, Bruce, it's open-ended. You can do it either way.
Okay. So I think, Peggy, to pick up on one of your earlier points, the committee was split. It was a narrow majority voting for an outright ban. But I think that the split in the committee fairly represented the correspondence that I'd received and the input that I'd received over the months leading up to that. So over the last 8 or 9 months. And I think it was that split that was causing me to recommend the through the committee and through a vote of the committee, the referendum, to put this to the legislative body for a decision. Because, I think everything else is just a poll. And because it's so close, we'd want to do that. I hear the concerns about sending ordinary ordinance questions to referendum and what kind of path that might set us on for future questions. So what Peggy and I discussed as a path forward, really the two parallel tracks that she mentioned, crafting an ordinance, which we've got a draft of, and putting that forward for public hearing. And at the same time, as a parallel path, running a survey and seeing what kind of information we get. And hopefully we would get some robust feedback. I don't believe we're going to get a clear consensus one way or the other.
Meaning more 50-50?
I think it's going to be, it's going to be within the margins of error of it. So I think we just kind of need to press forward with what we think our common sensibility is on this if we choose not to go the referendum path. And I'd like to share with you folks how I ended up on the side of prohibiting commercial activities. And that's my shorthand for selling it and growing it for the purposes of making a profit. The community has a pretty long history of being very discriminating on the types of businesses that we have in town. And we we noticeably don't have a Costco in town or a Walmart or any other big box stores. We don't have heavy industry in town. And so on that basis, I thought, okay, well, we know that there are businesses that don't quite fit in to the community, and maybe this is one of them. And for me, the reason was the family value nature of Madison. We are a very family forward community with an active and robust youth and family services, a very robust school district, and we in large part exist in service of our children and in service of the parents of those children. And I just felt that it was a mixed message to send to the efforts of the youth and family services and the school district. Hey, in spite of your consistent messaging to us that this is not a good thing in your opinion, we're going to go ahead and allow these activities anyways. So I very much see a ban is actually an affirmation of our commitment to supporting youth and family services in the school district and the families that have children in the school district. So that's how I arrived at that decision. I don't know if that
It's super helpful. Yeah, really helpful actually. Listen, I'm the Madison Youth and Family Services liaison. So, I sit in on countless meetings about, the challenges with substance abuse and the rise and fall of particular drugs that are addictive. I think, I tend to lean on the recommendations coming from Madison Youth and Family Services, just by nature of me being so connected to them. And, it is pretty clear that, this becomes, whether we like it or not, or agree with it or not, as a gateway drug. And, I think we have to be thinking about that in a responsible way from a community standpoint. And I have seen plenty of communities ban, and I am absolutely in favor of that, of banning at this point. I also think, I hearken back to my very simple analogy of we tried to get a darn Dunkin' Donuts up here in North Madison at the Circle, and we couldn't get that because of signage. So
Right.
how does that work then with a marijuana shop and signage of that? So I just think we got to be conscious of the messaging that we're sending to our community. It can't be a either or cherry picking what types of stores. We just need to be consistent. So, and that certainly is on the P&Z side, not necessarily on the Board of Selectmen side, but I think we see it from a governance and a policy standpoint. So I think we have to be wise. But I really do come back to the Madison Youth and Family Services aspect, and they have countless sessions of us talking about the excess of drug abuse, and that this is problematic. There was a letter written to the state from the town of Madison, talking about marijuana use and trying to suggest that it should be banned in general. So I think we've got to be very smart about this, and I'm in favor of banning.
I would agree with that as well. With my time spent on Board of Education, we just a few months ago, through Policy Committee, updated our policy with the Board of Education regarding alcohol, substance abuse, nicotine, marijuana, all of those things. And, it's clear that they are in concert with Madison Youth and Family Services in terms of what they feel is appropriate in terms of policy. And I also agree with what you're saying, Scott, and just in terms of consistency with the messaging of the types of businesses that we're going to allow in town, especially when there's opportunity for other communities that people from our community may want to utilize that sort of retail establishment. It's just as easy for them to go to another town to make that purchase as it is to purchase fast food.
I guess as the longest serving member of this board, I'll try to bring a sense of trajectory to this. I couldn't agree more with Bruce that the Madison of yesteryear would probably not only not like a Dunkin' Donuts sign, but certainly wouldn't like anything that looks like a head shop in town. And I think Bruce is absolutely right. What I'm a little more humble about is the fact we've had a lot of new folks move into town. And the demographic of those folks may be such that they feel on this matter differently than the Madison of yesteryear. I'm not sure about that. I think if we did choose to do a survey, again, I'm going to agree with Bruce. I think it's going to come out with split numbers, and the five of us are going to look at the survey results and then look at each other and say, now where are we? So my sense of the way forward here, unless Kerry tells us we're under some kind of time bind on this, is I'd like to put a proposed ordinance out there and gauge public reaction to that ordinance. And as far as I'm concerned, the draft ordinance that is in front of us is a very appropriate ordinance for us to propose for public consideration. So at this moment, I guess I'm agreeing with a lot of what Bruce said. I don't think this rises to the level of a referendum question yet, but let's wait and see what the public reaction is to our proposed ordinance before we decide whether it's not arrogant for us to pass it, or whether we really feel that this is something the public should decide. So just to conclude, I'd like to put the ordinance out there that Kerry has drafted.
I like that. I like that approach a lot, Al.
So it's interesting because I think there was two different reasonings about ban, right? One had to do with just past practices in the community, and what we haven't historically we haven't allowed in town. Well, to me, that's a zoning thing, right? The Dunkin' Donuts, the examples that Bruce gave, that's a zoning thing. The town, the Planning and Zoning Commission decided it doesn't want large industrial parks, or it doesn't want, so those were all zoning decisions, which to me says, ordinance that's not why we should be using an ordinance if we want to control the look and feel of the community, right? And what businesses are in the community. The other piece of this is the more values piece, right? Which we know now that this is legal. And we also know neighboring communities are going to be selling it. I think Guilford actually is allowing it now. Brantford has a dispensary. So access is going to be there, and it's going to be a issue for our youth, and as it always was, but now the accessibility is easier. So I feel like values is a little different than zoning, right? So I'm trying to figure out like what is a better path, because and that's where maybe I'm totally supportive of putting this out there, having the public hearing and doing the survey. But it may be that we go both ways. We ban the commercial component through zoning, right? But then the town ordinance about use of the uses that on town property should be an ordinance, right? Because now it's getting into, our kids are going down to the surf club and playing in the playground, and picnics are going on, and people are having cannabis drinks. Because let's face it, it's not just smoking; it's beverages and it's edibles, right? And that also, and one thing we have to discuss about is enforcement. How do you tell if that gummy is there for the 10, the 5-year-old versus the parents are enjoying it for other reasons and they're sitting on the beach, So there are going to be a lot of enforcement things around use. So I don't have the right answer today. I guess I'm hearing everything you've raised, I think, are important things to think about. And it might be that we have to have two separate paths, where we have zoning take action in one direction, and then we pass an ordinance in another direction. And maybe it might be different answers to them. The public might think, what's the big deal of having a pot shop in town? Let's get the revenue for it. That could come back, right? We don't know that. I doubt it, but that could happen. But that doesn't mean we want to allow people to use cannabis at the beach, right? So I think we just have to be open-minded and think this through a little bit. And I think this ordinance touches on all that. So it's a document that the public can react to and that we can get some feedback for.
I think usage too, Peggy, that's a slippery slope too, because obviously you've got medical marijuana, you've got, legal reasons to use marijuana. Yep. So I think we've got to be conscious of not over governing the usage, but I do think we have an opportunity to control the sales and the commercial aspect of it in town. And I think where
I do think about, though, with the usage, I mean, we controlled the usage of cigarette smoking and the usage of alcohol consumption where people
but do we as a town, though? We don't. It's the state.
Okay.
No, the town, though, bans smoking. We have an ordinance banning smoking
on public beaches
at our recreation facilities.
And
right.
the school has that as well. I mean, I know there are state regulations following that, but it's also policy within Madison Board of Education.
But the question becomes, and the ordinance that Carrie has drafted actually is more extensive than that. So it would be any cannabis products. And so if you're at Garvin Point and having a picnic, and one person's drinking a hard seltzer and one person's drinking a cannabis drink, which is becoming more and more common. So this ordinance would say you can't have the cannabis drink, but you can have the hard seltzer, right? Because we do allow alcohol in our picnic areas. So those are the details that we'll have to kind of talk through, I think, as we go through this about because smoking, I think, is simple to apply that for any kind of smoking. And I don't know, you could argue that I don't even think it says, I have to go back and read our ordinance on smoking. I don't know if it's tobacco products or and vaping. We probably haven't updated it in a while. We need to look at it in terms of all that.
Signage just says smoking, I think, so.
Yeah, so, it may be that we don't even need to worry about that, because if you're smoking cannabis or smoking tobacco, neither of them are allowed unless it does. We used to have a smoking area at the beach, I remember, but now that might be gone completely. So we'll need to look at that ordinance, but this actually is broader because it's applying to products. So somebody has a bunch of brownies down at Garden Point.
How do how do you enforce that? How do you know?
Yeah,
Like,
exactly.
Right.
So
some of this is like getting crazy, right?
Yeah. So
Yeah, I don't think we should get too wrapped up in the usage versus the intoxication, because that's really,
Mm.
that's where it kind of goes sideways for people.
Right.
When somebody is
Right.
visibly intoxicated
right.
from the use, and that's clearly a police matter,
Right.
and not
Exactly.
and not an issue of ordinance at all.
Yeah, but I'm just saying this ordinance says that you couldn't have that, cannabis brownie at the beach. And the problem is, what I've found in this office is oftentimes it's not the police, it's people around, it's neighbors that complain. So now you've got the public looking at what you're drinking, looking at what you're eating. So I'm just pointing this out. So that's where the enforcement becomes complicated, because the public now becomes part of that process, right? And looking and seeing and judging what you're eating or drinking at the beach. So I'm not weighing one way or the other. I'm just pointing out that these are all things, as we go through and think about this ordinance, we need to be conscious of.
But is there an
Because
opportunity here, Peggy, to walk before we run? So meaning we focus on the banning of the commercial sales and sort of the retail component of it first, as opposed to going down the path of maybe some of these other usage conversations.
right, and that might be it, because we might be covered on the smoking piece already through our own ordinance. And because I think everybody agrees, it doesn't make sense that somebody can smoke cannabis, but they can't smoke their cigarette, right? So we would need consistency there, I think, at a minimum. And then maybe we do think about uses separately. So maybe it's two separate ordinances, or we go planning and zoning. So Carrie, hopefully we're not tying you up in knots here.
No. Excuse me.
Yeah.
So as I had said to Peggy, I added all that in just for you.
Right.
Yes.
For conversation, it's
Yeah.
important. No, it's important. Yeah.
But I do want to say that my personal opinion on the use of cannabis in public really doesn't relate as much to the intoxication issue as the smoking issue. I think the notion is that, and I don't know about you guys, but cannabis stinks. I mean, I had to give a lecture for CCM at Mohegan Sun, and somebody smoked a cannabis cigarette in the elevator of the parking garage, and it smelled like skunk. I mean, it was so strong. The cannabis of today is not the cannabis of the 60s or 70s. It's way stronger, and it stinks to high heaven. And and this is not a personal reflection on my personal preference, but for me, the notion that you would ban smoking in public places and not ban the smoking, secondhand smoke from cannabis, would not be consistent, right? So maybe it's focusing on your existing ordinance and making sure that covers, it doesn't just talk about cigarettes. Or and again, I don't know, somebody here might know better than me, the vaping, if there's secondhand effects from vaping as well. I don't know the answer to that, to be honest. But as I had said to Peggy, oftentimes when it comes to the banning of cannabis on public property, it's really focused on the smoke aspects of it and the notion that it might affect the people sitting nearby, like on the beach or at a park or whatever. Not so much the person who consumes, a gummy under their umbrella while they're reading a book, right? So again, this is all, food for thought. and I'm open to whatever you suggest. But I do have to say that I think if you're going to ban cannabis in the town, probably it's best to do it by ordinance. If you're going to allow some aspects of it, probably better to do it by planning and zoning with conditions and restrictions on where it can go and when it can operate and all those special permit criteria. And then again, to the point, do you want to go even further and try to attempt to enforce an ordinance that would prohibit any cannabis use on public property, which to my knowledge, as of right now, we don't have a foolproof method of testing somebody for intoxication on cannabis the way we do on alcohol. So I think we all have to be mindful of that. I think, you know, if somebody really off the rails, then the typical parameters that an officer would use for public intoxication would apply. But again, like I said, the mom who chews a gummy and reads a mystery novel under a umbrella, I mean, you're not going to be able to enforce, you're not going to know.
Right,
Never.
right.
Never.
And that's where I think.
Nor do I
that-
think we want to. To me,
No,
that's
exactly. Yeah.
But I do feel strongly that in the end, whether it's banning the commercial sales or retail shops, we have an obligation as the Board of Selectmen to protect the youth. It's less to me about the community look and feel and, you know, historically, what have we looked like and, you know, blah, blah, blah. To me, it's about protecting our youth. And that's what we're about. We should be focused on that. Mental health, it's a real thing. And by the way, yes, Carrie, second and third hand is absolutely a thing with cannabis.
And
I've heard it talked about many, many times.
Yeah,
And
and the
Scott,
other,
I'm just going to tell you, personal opinion, you guys can put this on the shelf because I'm your attorney. I'm not on the Board of Selectmen, but I personally feel that cannabis abuse makes people stupid. And I've seen it. And I am very concerned about the next generation of kids that are going to grow up with it being sort of standard fare and what it might do long term to their mental and brain development. And so, Scott, I am totally on board with you as a human being. Obviously, I'm not on the Board of Selectmen for Madison. I'm just trying to, you know, again, at the behest of Peggy and Bruce, to provide you with something to chew on. We can modify it. I'm at your mercy. But I am totally with you. I think just as a society, we need to protect the next generation because they're the ones who are going to be governing us. Right. So I totally agree with you, Scott.
I think just in the interest of getting the conversation started, we take this draft, we put it on a hearing notice next Tuesday, and begin the conversation with the public for real. And at the same time, we can also take steps to get that survey moving forward and see what that does. But I think we have to start somewhere, and this seems like a pretty good place.
I agree. I think that's fair. You know, might we still end up with a 50-50 split? Yes, but at least then we actually have, hopefully, a broader segment of our population here in Madison that we're getting real thoughts from, and not just small segments, not just us, you know, thinking we know what people want, but let's give people an opportunity through public hearing and survey to put pen to paper.
I
The
would
flip
agree
side
with
of that
but-
argument, I mean,
Look.
just in fairness, right? We've gone down this path many, many, many times, right? The reality is we could have 5 people in the room that, you know, are at one extreme position or another. So, you know, to some extent, if we know what's right, we may need to put a stake in the ground and go for it, as opposed to sometimes in these situations, you know, I just don't feel strongly about the public hearing because I don't always feel like the public is going to show up and give us their input.
I don't disagree with that either. I mean, we see it time and time again where we think we're doing what people want and giving them an opportunity, and then we're sitting there with overwhelming lack of participation.
But-
Indeed.
My only, can I
Indeed.
just make one comment though? My only concern
Yeah,
of putting this out there is what we just talked about, the
usage piece.
use piece.
I agree
because
with you.
I don't want to create hysteria.
I agree with you. I think we should
When-
pull out the usage stuff.
Yeah, and maybe or restricted to, I think our smoking already probably covers this. But in item, so for section 3, I would argue that we would either strike that completely or just limit it to products, smoking products or something. Just because I don't want people to freak out and be like, this is ridiculous, that we can't go to the beach. People love Garvin Point, their picnics, and I just don't want to create unnecessary, unless some board members feel that we should be banning it completely, edibles and drinks and everything else from our beach facilities.
No, I think, listen, why don't we just put forward the draft on the commercial operations?
I agree with you, Bruce.
The usage, just, we can survey our existing ordinances around alcohol and tobacco and harmonize those and update those ordinances with cannabis use.
Okay,
And I think that naturally covers, your points, Peggy.
okay, good. And then I think we do need to, then we can work within our existing ordinances on the usage piece.
Right. And I don't think we need to have big public hearings on that. I think we can just
Yeah.
move that conversation forward.
I agree.
So just for my edification, so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna modify the draft ordinance to remove the usage, but I'm going to review your ordinance on smoking in public to
Well, that's a
ensure
great idea.
that it covers cannabis,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And if it doesn't, then you may have 2 ordinances that need to be, just to be clear.
Yeah, it's
Okay.
great. Yeah, good.
All right, I'm clear.
Also, if there is, I don't know how this works, but this concept of intoxication or behavior, I don't know if we have an ordinance that bans, does not allow certain types of behaviors.
But I gotta think isn't that just law? Isn't that just?
Well, yeah,
what
but
the
I
police
don't know
enforce?
what definitions, like, when you use words like intoxication, does that cover people who are high? I don't know. I don't know legally. I just want to make sure it would fall under the umbrella of whatever our ordinances are. That's all. So when you look at it, ensure, because that's an important, obviously we get rowdy groups and we get people that are misbehaving down there because of too much drinking, right? But that could also be people who are smoking too much or not smoking too much, imbibing, whatever it is too much. So when you look at that, Carrie, just maybe look at our ordinances in that way. To make sure.
Again, to Scott's point, I think that's more of a criminal, it's public intoxication, breach of peace.
State laws.
Okay, so that's all like,
That would be up to law enforcement to come
Yeah.
out and use their techniques for testing sobriety, and to make judgment calls. I mean, I don't think, nobody on this board wants to be, sending your zoning enforcement officer out to,
Do a breathalyzer test, right? Yeah.
I mean, I just
good.
think that
or to test gummy bears, what kind of gummy bears?
Yeah.
or test the brownies at the picnic
Yeah.
or whatever.
Correct.
Okay.
No,
So,
thanks.
again, in my mind, Peggy, if somebody is really being belligerent and bad behaved on the beach, you would treat that the way you would anybody who
Right,
acts
okay.
badly on the beach.
Okay.
And
Or in a store or in anywhere, right? It doesn't have to be
right.
just the beach, right? It could be anywhere.
you're right, any
Mhm.
public property. And so that would be a call to the police for breach of peace or disorderly conduct or whatever. All right, so we're going to remove from the draft ordinance the use and leave it to the commercial. And we are going to look at the existing smoking ordinance to ensure that it includes a ban on the smoking of cannabis products on public property.
Okay,
And then that, I think, is addressing the major concerns that we've talked about tonight, which is to prevent the secondhand smoke effects of cannabis and to prevent large cannabis retailers or cultivators to come to town.
Mhm.
Does that make? Okay, I've got it.
Right.
Nice.
The only thing that we haven't talked about, Carrie, that was in the state law was the towns can regulate the use of in the outdoor sections of private establishments. So for instance, a restaurant with outdoor seating, the town can put ordinances in place or not, I think, at their discretion. And I don't know, have you seen anybody addressing that directly?
Again, all of the ordinances or planning and zoning regulations that I've reviewed have focused on public property. I haven't seen anybody try to regulate private property. It's always been in the public specter.
I gotta
So-
think too, that's in it's sort of the landowner, the private landowner would, be smart to be restricting or doing things on their own too, right? I mean, that's on them.
The smoking though, the smoking
Right.
piece is state regulated anyways, right? For restaurants, isn't there a restriction? Yeah.
So this whole cannabis thing has sort of thrown that into a tailspin, Peggy. You're right. I did a comprehensive memo on this. I want to say, oh God, it's probably 3 years back now, where there was a question as to whether a local municipality had the right to override state law banning smoking at restaurants and outdoor spaces and that kind of thing. The conclusion 3 years ago was that the state has indicated its intent to commandeer that regulation. And we had advised that you really don't have the right to override the state on that. This cannabis legislation, though, it has sent everything into sort of a tailspin. We don't know how all of this is going to play out, to be honest with you, Peggy. I wish I could give you assurances. But to me, the legislation is clearly said when it comes to public property in your town, you have the right to, ban its use, ban its production. And, so when you get to private property, to me, it becomes a much more of a gray area.
Well, so I think that to be continued maybe on that, because I'm a little, I don't know what the law, for I guess in the state of Connecticut, because some states, no smoking period, indoor or outdoor, at restaurants. Is Connecticut allow it for outdoor restaurants? I can't, outdoor seating? I don't remember.
I didn't think it did.
I don't know. So, yeah, so I think that's an issue that we would need to come back and talk about maybe in the future. So I think then if we want
Like I
to
said, it was 3 years ago. But
Yeah.
at that time, outdoor smoking, just like, I don't know if you go to places that still have like that butt can at the door or whatever to get,
Yeah.
it's their property. They don't want you smoking inside, but outside there could be a smoking area. And
Yeah.
And that's their
Okay.
prerogative though. Yeah.
and that's
Yeah.
their prerogative.
Right,
And it's
right,
their property.
Right.
So and I'm not saying that we shouldn't look into it. I'm just saying
Yeah.
it becomes a bit grayer when you start to try to regulate private property.
We're gonna
Right.
be careful too, not to boil the ocean on this too. I think I would focus on the retail and commercial piece first as a starting point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm just thinking in terms of, we have to obviously vote to call a public hearing. Could we just do that tonight, amending the draft ordinance to include Article 2 only, which is the part on cannabis establishments?
So what I would suggest is that you go ahead and set the public hearing.
Uh-huh.
And that you allow me to amend to remove Article 1, and this would become Article 1, if you will.
Okay, yeah,
So I don't think I'd want to complicate it by saying, we're only going forward with Article 2. I'd rather have you set the public hearing for what is a final draft ordinance based on our discussions tonight. So,
Okay.
but then you can't set the date.
Yeah,
It
that's what I was just looking at, because I think it's good to get it out there, but give us a full, set it for a time in April, and then that way we'll also have the survey out, you know, and have some information back too. So we could set it a month from now and maybe do it before one of our meetings, you know, in April, or we can pick a date in April. Because usually I know like my assistant helps figure this out, but I know Jean hasn't really been able to do that. So just looking at the calendar, because our next meeting is, I mean, what we can do, why don't we just do this? We have a Tuesday morning meeting. I'll put it as agenda item. That way I can look at the calendar and figure out what might work for a public hearing. And then we could just call it on Tuesday.
All days.
Okay.
Yeah, it's
That's
fine.
fine.
Yeah, it's fine.
And I can certainly get to a revised ordinance by then, you know, without the,
Oh, perfect.
Okay, yeah, that'd be perfect. Then we'll just
It's
put
all
that
buttoned
on.
up.
I'll put it on the agenda, and that way we'll actually have a date, because I don't want to scramble and then find out that we can't get the register, you know, we can't get a room or something like that. So
and if you're gonna
So I'll
send a
move that
survey
we-
out, then I would just suggest that you give yourself enough breathing room. You know, you're right.
Okay.
Most people, if they're gonna respond at all, are gonna do it quickly. But I would just caution you, it takes and the mail is so slow today. And so I just think, you know, give yourself, if you really want the survey to be useful, give yourself enough time to get the responses. And maybe I'm also going to suggest that you have like a Dropbox or something where people can just drop their surveys off. They don't have to worry about mailing them. They don't have to, right? They can just swing by town hall and slip them into the box. And
I think we were thinking about an online survey.
yeah,
weren't-
we do a lot of online surveys.
even
yeah.
better. Even better.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
just, you know what I'm sensitive to, and this is what I get from the legislature all the time when I push back on public notice, which currently still requires newspaper notice. And this is a big topic right now. And I get pushback all the time. What about the people who don't have computers? What about the people?
Yeah.
And I've said, well, they can go to the library and borrow the computers there. But I'm very sensitive to that. So I always think about the members of the community that don't have ready access to online surveys.
Yeah, no, and we usually, when we've done surveys, we do online, but we also offer copies at the library and at the senior center and have a Dropbox. So you're absolutely right.
There you
And
go.
so that way they can participate, and we'll make sure to do that. And so I'll find out. And then I think maybe if board members want to review the draft Guilford's survey and make some suggestions, we could even have that finalized Tuesday and, you know, get it out there next week and then plan a meeting, a hearing in April. So I know this means, Bruce, this wouldn't be a referendum option, but it could be a referendum option for November, right? Because we wouldn't be able to, if we chose to go that route, you know, because I know you want to keep that as a possibility. Timelines,
It's not too late. You have to, like, I don't know, probably July, because then everything gets submitted in August. So if there was a
Yeah, we're
referendum-
fine for that. He had originally talked about our budget referendum, but
Oh.
we wouldn't be able to do that for a May ballot, but
That's
Right, we
Yeah,
would have to be committed to, we would have to be committed to that question now, so
right.
Yeah.
that doesn't work. But if we do jump back onto the referendum timeline, then we need to request that planning and zoning extend their moratorium. Their moratorium expires July 1st.
So by then you'll either have an ordinance or you'll know. I think you're in good shape time-wise.
Yep.
Okay.
All right,
So
I'll
I
move
guess
that we table item 5.
So
I'll
move.
second that.
Second,
Okay.
whenever you need it.
All in favor of tabling item 5?
Aye.
Aye.
Great. All right, great. So, all right, well, that was very helpful. Appreciate pulling the ordinance together quickly, and we'll get that on the next agenda. So the next item on the agenda, I am going to now hand over to Scott Murphy, because I think we talked about, this is a topic that there's a point where I felt like I had to recuse myself from the conversation. on short-term rentals. And so I think now's the appropriate time because Carrie's going to be discussing possible ordinances and options. And we had been working mostly with our town planner before, and I felt like to be more effective and targeted, Carrie has a great perspective on this, and then you can work directly with her on what that ordinance might look like. I also shared with her the presentation I gave during the January 10th meeting, I think it was, and I put that also, I sent that out last night because I know Jen was not a member of the
Right.
board at the time. So but that kind of walked through the conversation and the gradations of what the board had talked about. So with that, I will hand things over and I will jump off. And Scott, I think after that, you just do citizens comments and adjourn the meeting. Okay.
Do that. I can do
Okay.
that. Thank you,
All right,
Peggy.
guys.
Yep.
So have a good conversation. Thank
Enjoy
you.
your dinner, Peggy.
All right. Good night.
See ya. All right, so short-term rentals, we've had plenty of board comments and conversation on this topic. I know it's been sort of discussed ad nauseum relative to what is the issue, what is the problem, what are we trying to focus on here relative to the actual issue at hand. And so Carrie, I know you, I think, have some thoughts maybe on getting us started in the direction of an ordinance. Do you want to maybe kick that off and then we can kind of discuss where we take it from here?
So I'm going to be completely candid.
Please.
He sent out that email last night and I have been in court hearings all day, so I've not had a chance to absolutely study it. But I have been involved in advising her and others on the various correspondence that have come in from some of your residents on short-term rentals. And just to give you an update, this was sent to your land use council, which is Ira Bloom from Birch Moses. And Ira and I know each other very well. We go way back. And he put together a response to their position that the current zoning regulations do not allow STRs, but based on court decisions and analyses of the existing regulations. Just in a nutshell, the problem is that STRs, which are short-term rentals to people who want to stay at your house for a short period of time with their family and vacation and drive down to the road to the beach, et cetera, et cetera. The problem is that when a family rents your house and a residential use of your house is permitted in the zone, it makes it extremely difficult, if not impossible, to prohibit the use of your property. So think about it. You would all agree with me that this board has no right to tell any one of you that you can't rent your house for a year, right? Or 6 months to anyone, to your children, to their friends, right? It's a residential use. It's somebody who's using the property as their home and residence. So the problem, and I'm trying to not get too nuanced here. The problem is that even when somebody only stays at your place for a week or 2 weeks or a month, it's still a residential use, right? They're not turning it into a car park or, a cannabis retail establishment or whatever. It's a retail use. And residential use. And if a residential use is permitted there under your zoning regulations, it's a very hard thing to tell somebody that the regulations prohibit them from allowing somebody to stay at the house for less than 30 days or whatever is being proposed.
So I hear that, Carrie, but then, and I'm playing a little devil's advocate here on purpose. How is that different than renting a hotel room for a week or renting a bed and breakfast for a week? Aren't those both residential uses by that definition?
No,
Right,
so
I was gonna ask that.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Jen.
Oh, no, that's okay. I was just gonna say, that's the same question that popped to my mind as well, specifically like bed and breakfast. How is that use different than?
It's not residential. I don't think it's commercial.
Yeah,
Retail.
so that's where we're headed, is the notion that, so for example, a hotel is clearly a commercial use. That's how it's defined. That's, they have to be licensed, they have to apply, yada, yada, yada. And again, when it comes to a resident, a family coming and staying at your house, I think all of you could agree with me, right? And again, I'm not trying to be difficult, but to be the devil's advocate to Bruce's devil. If you invited a family to come stay at your house for a week while you were in Colorado skiing, but didn't charge them, would anybody have a right to tell you that that's not lawful under your current zoning regulations? So these are the nuances that everybody is grappling with when it comes to STRs. You are not alone, Madison. Towns across the state, frankly, across the country, have been grappling with this. And most communities have dealt with it by saying, if there is no outward impact that's offensive, a public nuisance or a private nuisance, then you really don't have the right to tell somebody they can't let a family borrow their house.
Well, I think that to me, Carrie, is where I think we as a board have been struggling, and sort of, I think that the stake in the ground that we've been moving directionally towards is the registration component, because I think we have struggled with defining what the problem is relative to short-term rentals. Is it noise related? Is it garbage related? Is it, one particular house? Is it 6 houses? Is it 50 houses? I don't think we know and understand the magnitude of the problem because we just don't have the data.
Yeah.
And so I think that was the intent, I think, originally of, and I'm speaking for us guys, so, catch me if I'm missing something here, but I think directionally, this is where we were headed, which was, let's at least start to get our arms around the challenge and the problem here and put something in place that focuses on registering the short-term rentals, so we at least know who's who in the zoo.
Yeah, I get it. So, and I am not opposed to you asking, but I do want to be clear that enforcement of that and follow up on that could be very difficult, because unless you have somebody who's prepared to spend their free time surfing VRBO and Airbnb, you're not going to know whether somebody registered or not. You may get a complaint from a neighbor, which gives you the heads up. But by and large, you're never going to capture 100%. If you follow me, because there will be people who either don't know about the registration requirement or flaunt it, ignore it.
Yep.
Well, I think that where I agree on the registration is we should have it because it becomes another avenue for enforcement, not so much that we're going to verify the properties against a known list. It's, if we have a bad actor and they didn't register, it's a very easy way to just shut the whole thing down. I think
maybe it's a nuance too, Bruce. Maybe it's register and not follow the guidelines too, right? Because I would assume in the registration piece, we would have a series of things that they have to do to be compliant, right?
Like what?
Safety, whatever, safety, fire extinguishers, whatever, right?
Okay,
but that's regulatory.
I'm sorry, let me stop you here, because we didn't get a chance to do this. Again, this meeting took place with Peggy very late on Thursday. We're trying to coordinate a discussion with your public health director, your fire marshal, your, all of the players, your building official, to find out, because one of the things that concerns me is that once you put this in place and you put guidelines in place that say you have to do ABC, what becomes the town's obligation to follow up? And where does that place you? There was a relatively recent Bridgeport decision that basically found that a building official had an obligation to inspect for smoke and CO detectors on rental properties. Do you want to take that on?
Meaning it exposes us to liability.
That's where I'm
It
headed.
creates an obligation.
It may. I did not have a chance to meet with all your officials because again, I'm not, I know enough to be dangerous. I don't know the building code front and back.
But that is a planned event. You guys are getting together to at
Yes,
least
we were
start to
hoping to
have
get
that.
together
Okay,
this-
that's helpful.
Yeah, we were
Yeah,
hoping to get together this week, but it just didn't happen yet.
That's fine. Yeah.
Um,
So Carrie, as we've talked about that particular aspect, we've talked about a self-certification process with the town having the right to exercise an inspection. So not that the town shall inspect, the town may inspect at its discretion. That may not be sufficient in the scenario that you're talking about, but we did recognize that that at the very least, there should be a self-certification of the properties.
you mean that they certify that it meets all of the building code and all that?
Right, and we could provide them with a list that they would, check off, right? They've got CO2, they've got fire extinguishers, they've got smoke, they've got exit signs, they've got, proper egress,
Right.
all of that. And then we would have the right to inspect them at our discretion.
So 2 points on that. I don't have an issue necessarily with self-certification. But imposing on them the ability to inspect, to me, I think you're going to have a constitutional issue there, and I don't know that that's going to fly at all. I mean, I
Yeah,
think
I could
Thanks.
see how if we're only inspecting some and then it turns out
Right.
people look into it and we're only inspecting one that are having calls with complaints. And I know there's other things, going through the legislature now as proposed bills with even just renters and background checks and that sort of thing. Not using them as frequently because they can be used as bullying mechanisms is what is being said. I could see how that just presents issues, leaves us open for.
Well, I think, yeah, I think for me, where it really becomes a hard line for me is we regulate strictly bed and breakfasts, we regulate strictly hotels. And
But
yet
do
it is
you?
virtually the Wild West.
no, but do you, Bruce, really? You have, hotels, the operation of which is governed by state law and licensing. And you don't really go in and locally, right? And maybe I'm wrong. And then when it comes to bed and breakfasts, right? They have to be approved. They have to meet certain criteria. And one of the criteria for bed and breakfast is that the owner be on site, which gives, I think, everybody a different level of comfort. It's more like you're having friends over, but you might be charging them for a room. But you
Carrie,
live in,
That's my point
Yeah.
exactly, that there are well-established laws, regulations, and corresponding, enforcements around those types of guest housing.
but I don't
and-
think you regularly inspect bed and breakfast in Madison. I could be wrong.
Health inspector probably does, I would think, but it's probably not every few weeks. It's probably once a year.
Oh, okay, so that's not my point exactly, Carrie. I can't hang a shingle out in my front yard and call myself Bruce's Bed and Breakfast without meeting some regulation.
You have to have a zoning permit. Yes.
Right. But I can rent my house out virtually just as many guest nights as a VRBO or an Airbnb and do nothing. And I think that leaves a big public safety gap in the community that I don't think we should ignore.
And Bruce, you are preaching to the choir. But again, I say to you, every community in Connecticut and probably every state in the United States right now is grappling with this. It is really tough because you're balancing the right of individual property owners to do what they want with their property as long as the use is permitted under zoning. The fact that I have you, Bruce, and your entire family over and to stay at my house while I go to Bermuda, maybe you're house sitting for me, right? Arguably,
Terry,
Right,
you
but other
are
communities are writing
wisely-
regulations. Other communities are writing ordinances and
yes,
moving forward.
yes. And I'm not saying that we don't write an ordinance and move forward, Bruce. Do not get me wrong. But I feel as your attorney that I need to meet with all of the officials who may be charged with enforcing that to make sure you are all aware of what the ramifications of that may be. And it may be nothing. And I don't have
you are wisely cautioning us about the negative aspects of regulation. And yet Bruce keeps reminding us that other communities have chosen to take action. If I could focus this question, what have other communities done that's been successful? And what problem were they trying to solve? Can you give us any insight?
Yeah. So I can tell you a number of communities attempts to regulate short-term rentals have been met with challenges. And we provided case law to your greatest objectors on that front, which again is in line with what I have just said to you, Bruce, is the notion that if it's a permitted use in the zone, where does your ability to regulate or to enforce, where does that end and the privacy rights of the owner of that property begin? And again, it's a tension that it's fraught with, we can't rush into something. We have to certainly clearly think something through here.
Right. And I hear that. I think, again, as a layperson, a residential structure that exists to generate income, while it may be a residential use, it's a business. A rose is a rose is a rose.
Yeah.
And I think that our justification for moving forward with regulations is simply that fact. This is a de facto business. I think the fine line we want to walk is to not step on what is a longstanding tradition in Madison of rentals, and
Yeah.
certainly not to punish people that are finding a way to do it in a responsible way. And we've heard a lot of testimony from or comment from people who have said so much, right? They're, and hold themselves up as an example of this can be done and it can be done responsibly. I agree 100%. And we do not want to step on that in any of this work that we do.
But that said, Bruce, I think that in lies the conundrum, right? Because where Carrie was going earlier was, if in fact we regulate and we choose to go down that path, we also then regulate, which will require staffing and people to go do the regulation and enforcement and all of that. So, we got to go in with our eyes open that it could disrupt, it could change, it could refocus, town staff and our employees and our law enforcement and things like that. So I still think I want to come back to where we start the conversation always, which is, what is the problem we're trying to solve? And if the problem is noise, we should put a noise ordinance in place. If the problem is disruptive renters, well, that's going to be a little tricky, because as we've talked about many times, because sometimes that's going to be a screening mechanism, maybe of Airbnb or the RBO or whatever. That may not be something we want to take on as a regulating body. So I think until we have a sense of what the problem is, I'm struggling with putting in regulations because that may have a downstream impact on town employees.
So, from my perspective, it seems like one of the biggest issues is people that are experiencing disruptions don't really have a recourse for assistance, right? There's community members that have rentals next to them or near them. They're experiencing disruptions, and there's no mechanism for them to really have this righted. So is there
But do
any
they?
sort-
Do they though, Jen? Like, I challenge that statement in the sense that, I mean, why can't people call 911?
No, and they very well can, but say, I guess what my point is, say it's a rental that is consistently having renters come in that are disruptive. It's not the one-off, right? It's a
right. It's
particular house that
the one
has
that
a
always does it, right?
that always does it, that has the string of bad renters. So is there any, we don't have, I'm assuming, any sort of monitoring in place to track if a particular residence is receiving a multitude of phone calls?
Well, that was the
to
point, I
report
think, of
that?
going down.
Jen, let me just backtrack. When you're talking about that one property that is driving people crazy, that's a private nuisance. They have
Okay.
rights under the law to go after their neighbors for private nuisance. And I say this all the
Okay.
time to my municipal clients. There is a fine line between when a town should get involved in a private dispute, right? And legislate and dictate to all,
Yeah.
or say to the person, you need to, get your attorney and follow whatever path you deem appropriate to deal with what's driving you crazy for that particular property. And I go back to what Bruce said. I didn't get to interject, but he says, anytime you have a property that, and I'm paraphrasing Al because I couldn't write that fast, that exists for rental income, you have a de facto business, which should be subject to apparently some kind of regulation. I mean, again, there are probably a number of houses in your town that are leased long-term, 6 months, month-to-month tenancies. Do you really want to start regulating every leased property in your town? I don't think so.
So the state recognizes a break between 29 days and 30 days. So they recognize that there is a threshold where you convert into a long-term tenant, right? Hence the short-term rental. So a 2-month tenant is viewed differently and has different rights actually than a 2-day rental. And even a month-to-month renter who's, doesn't have a formal lease in place, that long-term renter is in a different space regulatory-wise than a short-term rental. And Scott, I think the opportunity here is other towns have done some really thoughtful work on setting the stage for avoiding some of these chronic problems. For instance, they established the number of people in the house as a derivative of the number of beds, right? So you can't have, if you have a 3-bedroom house, you can have 6 people, right? 2 people per bedroom. You can have a limited number of cars depending on the parking capacity, right? Because that's the other complaint we hear is that, somebody rents a house, invites 15 of their friends, and the cars are parked all over the place. These are straightforward. Yes, they might be some enforcement headaches that come along with it, but I think that we don't have to do a lot of inventing of the wheel or reinventing of the wheel. We've done a lot of work. Aaron has done a lot of work of cherry picking some very, very thoughtful ordinance language that I think that can work. Some other easy wins. There is a a sort of a good neighbor form that the renter has to sign, that they acknowledge all of our local peculiarities, like, the parking and the partying and the, that kind of stuff. There is a requirement that if you're going to be renting and you're absent, that you have a responsible person who can be called. And that information gets distributed to the immediate neighbors.
And although
So-
that's what I was alluding to about guidelines, though. So in the context of registering a short-term rental, maybe those are things that we put forward. The trick is going to continue to come back down to, though, enforcing that. So to your example, Bruce,
Exactly.
if you've got 5 cars versus 3, is the police even going to know that that's a short-term rental? 1, and 2, are they going to know that that was under agreement to have 3 cars versus 5? I mean, I think that is going to be hard to enforce.
I mean, I really think about it. And Bruce, to your point, I am not saying we can't do something. I want you all to understand the limitations on the efficacy of anything we come up with. If you say, okay, every house along the shore, no more than 4 cars. Well, what if somebody who's not leasing their house, has a party, right? Are they now suddenly, a violator, right? I mean, I just have to say, like you said, enforcement is going to be tough.
Well, so it's going to be tough. I get that. This is a difficult topic, but I think we need to move past discussing how difficult it's going to be and move towards actually doing something.
Well, I agree with you, Bruce. I thought that was
then-
our focus. I thought our focus here was
Right.
to drive to a registration ordinance such that we're at least putting a stake in the ground to understand what the problem is. Because
And I
until
think
we have
there's enough
data,
work out there. I think there's enough work out there that we can draft something more comprehensive. Remember, this is all going to public hearing. We're going to be, again, populating an ordinance of some sort with ideas to get public reaction to. I think we have an opportunity to do a lot more than just the registration. And I think we don't need to do any more quantification of what the problem is. The quantification for me is the very robust and continued input that we're getting from people that believe they're impacted by it on both sides. So,
Bruce,
So
I
again,
don't want-
my point, if I may, my point was not that we can't draft something, but I feel obligated as your attorney that every single one of you go into this with your eyes wide open as to the efficacy of it and what lies down the road. So I'm happy to do whatever you ask me to do, but I sit here as your attorney and say that there are going to be issues. And I don't want any one of you coming back to me and saying, Carrie, you told us this would work. Because I'm not telling you that. And
no, it's all going to be Scott's fault. Don't worry.
okay. As long as it's all Scott's fault, I'm good. And I hope this is being recorded. So
well, I think we've got to get to a point where we're at least putting a stake in the ground here with some. I think, again, that's kind of where I started this, right, Bruce, which was we've talked about this a lot. And I think we've got to get to a point where we're doing something. We absolutely recognize that there's some level of a problem out there because of the input we've received from the public. But at the end of the day, I think we've got to start somewhere. And to me, the starting point is a registration ordinance, at least to get something out there. I'm not comfortable moving, and I know you are, so we can debate that, but I'm not comfortable taking it farther than that at this point until I understand and feel that I have data, that we've talked to our town employees and understand with our eyes wide open the implications of enforcement.
Bruce, I don't want my question to you to sound snarky. I'm trying to be very careful here, but in 2 sentences, what is the problem you think we're trying to solve? And what is the ordinance that you would like to see proposed?
So I think that we are, we're experiencing a paradigm shift in how residential properties are being used and rented, right? So we've got a decades old history of the casual renting of homes in Madison, especially down the shoreline. The VRBO and the Airbnb is a technology shift that we really didn't plan on. There is at its core, I think, a real quality of life discussion that needs to happen. The people who buy their dream home, whether it's up in Scott's neighborhood or my neighborhood or down along the water, have an expectation of what that space is going to be like when they buy the property, and certainly if they've been there for a long time. And I think that we have a responsibility to make sure that isn't being abused. And I say this with all seriousness, there is absolutely responsible renting happening, and we can't step on that. I don't think, well, I'm sorry, we shouldn't. There is irresponsible renting going on, and I don't believe there's any amount of regulation we can do that completely eliminates it. I think we can just put in place a clearer path to trying to stop it when it does crop up. I am also, I have that big fear of somebody pulls into a property at 10:30 at night, bleary-eyed. They have not seen the facility in the house in the daylight. They plop down on their beds and heaven forbid, 2 hours later, there's a fire and they don't know where they are or how to get out. We would never allow a bed and breakfast or a hotel to operate with that kind of risk. And I don't think we should allow a for-profit rental to operate that way. And then, not for nothing,
Bruce,
but
can I
if you
just say,
own,
I just
if
want
you
to
are,
say, do you realize right now, everything you just said suggests that the town of Madison is now going to be responsible for all of these properties, for ensuring that they provide safety for the people that they lease properties to, that the neighbors don't get pissed off, to be frank. I mean, you're taking on,
slippery
you're
slope.
you're taking on a lot. You're taking on a lot of what I would argue are private disputes between neighbors potentially. And I'm just cautioning you because it's a slippery slope. People are going to expect things from you. And I'm just cautioning you. I'm
Well,
not saying
and
you
that
do
slippery
it.
slope requires governance. That's the right, and enforcement. So I think again, eyes wide open. We've just got to be conscious of what we're entering into.
We absolutely have to be conscious and have to modulate what we can and can't do, right? We can't overstep our resources. But the conclusion to my thought is that the owner who lives in Kentucky has 3 homes in Madison that has never ever visited. They are full-time rentals. If the lead company moved to Madison, we would charge them property tax on everything in their building. From an economics perspective, I don't see any difference. And I think, that's where we get back to kind of full circle of, at that point, it's really not a residential use. It's a commercial hotel. And again, so we've got the person who lives in their house or lives in their carriage house and rents out their house. They're always on property at one end that we want to be very sensitive to. And then we've got the commercial LLC that owns a string of houses that there is purely an investment and an income stream for them.
That was going to be a follow-up question that I had, Carrie. Is there any way to, through ordinance, determine a difference between privately owned, like individual owned properties versus corporate or LLC owned properties, things that really seem to constitute more of a business in terms of rentals.
So again, and I hate to keep being the devil's advocate and the naysayer here. Do you know how many houses on your Madison waterfront are owned by LLCs or trusts that are not commercial at all? I mean, again, the magnitude of work that you would have to do to try to differentiate and then avoid the challenge for differentiating between a family LLC and a corporate. I mean, think about how difficult that would be to do. And I am not trying to be a naysayer. I think the registration idea is actually a good one, because at a minimum, if there's a problem, you got somebody to call.
Yeah.
And say, listen, there's stuff going on at your house. We're getting complaints. If you don't take care of it, the police are going to be there,
Yeah.
Jen,
No, and I don't take this as being naysaying at all. I mean, I appreciate this information. I know I'm much newer to the conversation than the rest of the group, but I also see that there are members of the public that are in attendance now and that will come back and watch this meeting. So
yeah, Jen, welcome to the Board of Selectmen. And Jen, what would you like to see as the next step?
We lost Jen. We're getting robotic voice.
So actually,
Jen,
Al,
you're
I'll
frozen.
propose, Aaron has done quite a bit of work pulling together some information, really relying heavily on the Simsbury ordinance.
I think Jen's still talking. I think Jen's still, we're getting the delay of Jen talking.
Yeah. I think that should be, we should circulate that amongst the,
as they pop into our heads. But no, I think it's great. I think that for us is very pertinent for the public to hear as well.
Jen, go on mute for a sec. You're there's something going on with your phone.
Oh, I think she just jumped out. Oh, no, she's back. You're back.
We just had like robot Jen for like 10 minutes.
Yeah, no, not quite 10 minutes, but Jen, there was a lot we missed.
Jen, I was trying to ask you, are you with us, Jen?
No, she froze again.
Okay, right aside this cake. Yes, I am.
Oh, well, Jen, I was saying, welcome to the Board of Selectmen, and what do you think we should do as the next step?
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. I was going to try and hop on with my phone. I don't know what's going on with the internet here. Gosh, well, that's a loaded question, Al. I know.
Speaking to the mic closely, Jen.
Yeah, but make sure everyone can hear you.
We're losing you, Jen. Jen, we're losing you. Sorry.
We got robot.
I gotta play moderator here a little bit, guys, just because we're gonna.
I don't know how.
Can I? So
process as well for what is going on?
Jen, can you just go on mute because it's not good. Sorry. Let me propose a couple of actions. So, and just see if we're all on the same page. So one, Terry is obviously going to meet with the town employees and come back to us with some thoughts and ideas on the impact in terms of governance and what that may look like. So I think that input is going to be invaluable to us. Second, I think Bruce, you suggested let's look closer maybe at what Aaron has done already, and see what we might be able to leverage. Third, I'd love to see a draft registration ordinance, and just in the spirit of getting us moving in a constructive direction here, and registering our short-term rentals. And maybe there's aspects of, I can't remember the colors, Bruce. We talked about it at one meeting, but it was, sort of moving from the green to the orange or something, right? There was stuff that was in the middle category. Maybe we have an ability to bleed some of that into the registration ordinance. So maybe those are 3 concrete actions that we can take away just to sort of bring this conversation to a close.
I'm
Yeah, the draft that Aaron is working on does have that registration component to it. And then goes on to, discuss some of the safety aspect and stuff like that. So what you're talking about is in the document that I'm referring to.
Has Carrie seen that at this point?
I have not seen it yet. No.
Okay, so let's get that to Carrie as a next step. Aaron, I
I'm good
think
with
you're
your
on.
suggestion. Scott, I'm good with your suggestion. And I'm hoping Jen can either give us a thumbs up or speak to us.
Thumbs up.
Thumbs
The
up.
majority.
Hopefully, I don't have any further issues.
We can hear you.
Okay, good.
Good.
Well, it sounds like I have my directions. I will touch base with Aaron again to see if we can get that meeting sooner rather than later.
And given Peggy had to step out from this conversation, Carrie, I guess just use me as sort of the liaison for now
Absolutely,
to the
Scott.
Board of Selectmen relative to this particular topic.
Do I have your direct email? I don't know if I do.
I'll text you. I think I have your cell phone.
Yes.
I'll get you.
Perfect. Bruce has me too. He knows my personal cell.
Yep.
Okay, so I'm gonna meet with the employees and the officials and discuss their thoughts. Look at what Aaron has done as vis-a-vis a draft ordinance patterned off of Simsbury, and I try to put together a draft quote registration ordinance that you can use as a stepping stone, and you can meld it and decide what you want to do with it.
Sounds good.
Yeah, and I would
plan.
review what Aaron has done first before you go running off creating a new ordinance, because I mean that it has a heavy registration component to it.
Yeah, no, that's why it was step 3.
Perfect.
It was after looking at what Aaron.
All right, gang, I'm going to bring us to a close here with this
Sounds
topic,
good.
if everybody's okay. Thumbs up?
Yep.
We're good?
Yep.
And let us move to public comment. And so those members of the public who are out there, if you have a comment, feel free to raise your hand and we will bring you into the meeting. Please make sure that you keep your comments to 2 minutes at a maximum. And if you could state your name and your address for the record, that would be helpful. So Jean, if you could begin that process.
I have begun it and I am trying to promote people as we speak. I hope Carrie stays on.
I have Carrie. Yep, she's still here, I think. Yep.
I'm here, but what I'm concerned about is my video and my might be aggravating.
RC, I'm trying to promote you to panelists. Please accept.
So the members of the public, you actually have to accept becoming a panelist to come into the meeting to be able to speak. So maybe move, if we can't get RC in, can we go to Linda Marino or the next one?
I just want you to be aware, I'm here.
Yep, we got you. We got you.
I'm muting and keeping the video off is because it just decreases the amount of.
Yep, we got you. You're good.
Linda, you're muted.
Linda, you just have to unmute yourself. There
Sorry,
you go.
thank you.
There you
It's
go.
Linda Marino, 145 Middle Beach Road. I just want to say that I respectfully disagree wholeheartedly with Attorney Olson's statement that because you have your house is allowed to be used as a residence, ipso facto, you can use it as a short-term rental. There are in fact cases all over the country where houses and residential uses cannot be used as short-term rentals. What the courts do is they analyze the regulations or the ordinance at issue, and they determine whether or not the regulations permit the use of single-family dwellings in residential areas as short-term rentals. And I reviewed Ira Bloom's letter and I wrote a response. We've provided a response dated February 17th, 2023 to his analysis, which again, I think establishes that under the current regulations, short-term rentals are not allowed in the town of Madison. There are many reasons set forth in my letter for that. I quote a case from the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania, which says that under the regulations at issue there, short-term rentals are not allowed. So just because a house is in a residence district, it does not mean that short-term rentals are allowed under a town's regulations, and the regulations have to be looked at specifically. And under Madison's, for all the reasons I set forth in my February 17th letter, I believe, and the group of us that signed it, short-term rentals are not presently allowed under the regulations. I would like to also address that certain select persons' comments that we don't know what the problem is. Community members have expressed what the problem is. No one moved into Madison expecting to live next to a hotel or motel. There's no sense of community. You don't get to know your neighbors. People are coming and going all the time. It erodes security and a sense of community, on top of all the other problems that may or may not occur during any particular rental. You wait with bated breath as to what each rental party is going to be like in that house next door to you. I'd also like to just reiterate with what Bruce said. Yes, state law, there is no landlord-tenant relationship with 30-day rentals. Only longer-term rentals arise a landlord-tenant relationship. And I think that differentiates the nature of long-term rentals versus short-term rentals. Lastly, I'd like to address the issue about people saying enforcement is very difficult. I think enforcement is difficult of all regulations, all statutes, all rules. You can't have a meth lab in your basement. Is that easy to enforce? No, because you don't know if people do or don't have them in their basements. But it doesn't mean that you don't regulate that. Also, one last comment. I'm sorry, Attorney Olson keeps saying how incredibly difficult this is going to be, how also, how the terrible things it's going to wreak on the town. Why have so many other towns, in the best interest of their communities, enacted regulations and curtailed short-term rentals? My fear is if we don't start addressing this now, we're going to change the nature of Madison, and you're going to get more and more short-term rentals. You're going to more and more erode the community, and we're going to have a different town. And as it is right now, it's been a trend. It is very difficult for the residents who have the short-term rentals around them. And we've been trying to express that to the Board of Selectmen, and I just like to reiterate it. It's a trend that just keeps getting bigger, and it's bad as it is now, and we do need some relief.
Thanks, Linda. Okay. Do you want to try to go back to RC?
Yep.
Any acceptance?
Not yet.
Yeah.
And you can remove Linda from the meeting. All right, let's go to Daniel Miller. And if others have comments, please feel free to raise your hand.
Hi, am I being heard?
Yep.
You are, sir.
Okay, hi.
Name and
great.
address, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure, of course. Daniel Miller, Sunset Road, Madison. I want to thank the board for this discussion. It's been very illuminating. I have two small comments. One, as someone who does engage in the occasional short-term rental, I am in full support of a registration. I think there's a lot of positives to that that would help. It only with voluntary compliance. There's lots of things. I don't think people in the town, the vast majority, are looking to get over on something. I think most of the people in Madison, which makes Madison the place that it is, want to follow the rules, want to be good neighbors, want to do all those things. If you give them a structure which they can, exist happily behind, I think the vast majority of people will follow that. I also think that there's a double path here that you guys have kind of suggested, which is the registration and then issues. You use existing ordinances and you call the cops. I think I've said this a number of times on here. That's your out. If there's an issue, you call the cops, and the cops have lots of tools at their hands that they can use to solve issues with neighbors, the private property, and things like that. So those are really the two things that I wanted to say. Thank you for your time, and thank you for listening to my comments.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Any other comments from the public? I see one hand raised. I think we've tried RC several times. Oh, we've got one more. I see Laura Palumbo would like to speak. Hi, Laura, you just
muted,
need
Laura.
to unmute yourself.
Okay, just two things.
Just name and address real quick.
Laura Palumbo, 145 Middle Beach Road, Madison.
Thanks.
We were wondering if we would, if and when we would get a response to the letter dated 2/17/23. That was one thing to go on the record. We hope we get a response. And with the short-term rentals, I think you really have to experience it. There's such a difference between living with a neighbor where you get to know your neighbors coming and going. And if all of a sudden, if you're on a small lot and the house next door becomes a short-term rental, you really have to put yourself in that situation to imagine the problems. We have one friend, they had a wonderful neighbor. Their 9-year-old daughter had a relationship with the neighbor, would have tea with the neighbor. The house got sold. It's a short-term rental, and there's a real sense of insecurity rather than the sense of community. When we had the problem one summer, a friend came to dinner. She saw, 10 cars. She said, "What's going on?" I said, "Well, the house, across the street is now a short-term rental." And her reaction was, "I'm going to go and lock my car." And it's just not that, kind of Madison mindset. Another friend, neighbor on Middle Beach, she has some problem houses next to her. And one weekend last summer, there were more people in the short-term rental than there were at the Madison Beach Hotel. So I just want to thank you for your time and attention to this. I think, moving toward regulation, there have been so many issues. 2 summers ago, there was septic system that, exploded because of a party. Some of these houses just aren't geared up for this kind of use. And I think you're going to provide a lot of clarity, and I hope you keep moving forward with your regulations. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura.
Thanks.
Any other, looks like we have Annette. I do want to keep trying RC, but,
I'm going to lower that hand, RC's hand, and we'll see if that person is even still here by raising their hand again.
Sounds good. Thanks. Hi, Annette. You just need to unmute yourself, name and address. Annette, you are in the meeting. You just need to do it on your end. You need to unmute. There she is.
There we go.
You have to unmute yourself. We can't hear you. Bruce, do you have the ability to unmute her?
I don't.
I
do not. I can ask.
We can't hear you, Annette. Right at the bottom of the screen, there should be a mute or unmute option. Maybe put your question or your comment in the chat for the record. Okay, thanks. Let's go to Joe next. Hi, Joe. You just need to unmute yourself. Name and address.
Hi, I'm Joe Berlai-Parambil, live on Circle Beach Road, Madison. I do own an SDR, and it's really surprised and shocked to hear some of the comments. I stay there for a couple of weeks or sometimes more during summer, and then the rest of the time I rent it out. I think that's a reasonable thing to do, and we ensure that everybody that comes in respects the neighborhood. And if I've never had any complaints. So, I mean, I'm open to the registration aspect of it, and as long as it is within reasonable rights, would be okay with the registration. But I don't think it would be appropriate to completely block the STR option for folks that want to afford a beach house and maybe get some money to pay for the taxes or the insurance.
Perfect. Thanks,
Thank
Joe. Any other hands raised? Going once?
We had one and it went away.
Yeah, going once, going twice. Anybody? Okay, I will, let's call it a close. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
So
So
moved.
moved.
I will second that motion.
Second.
We will, all in favor?
Aye.